Government authority. Since God has established government authorities to be His servants in administering justice, there may be times as believers when we should appeal to a court of law. Here's Gene.
When Festus replaced Felix, the next governor, Paul faced the same problem, political favoritism. You see, Felix actually left him in prison for 2 full years before he transitioned out of his role. And the reason he did it basically was to please the Jews. He didn't want to get out of harmony with the Jewish community. At the same time, he was walking that fine line of fulfilling the Roman law. Now, his replacement was Festus. And we have the same basic problem. Paul faced the same problem in the sense of political favoritism. We read about it in Acts 25:9. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and be tried before me there on these charges?" Now, let me give you the background to this question now that Festus, who replaced Felix, is asking Paul, because he inherited this situation. What is he going to do with this man who's in custody? So the background is that Festus actually went up to Jerusalem. That was very wise. It was a political move to go up to Jerusalem and be there among the Jewish people. And basically what happened is when he got to Jerusalem, the Jews wanted Festus to bring Paul back to Jerusalem so they could ambush him. I mean, that was part of their scheme. Now, they didn't say that, but Festus saw through the scheme. And so basically he told them, no, I'm not going to bring Paul up here. You come down to Caesarea. And so they did. And once again, they brought false accusations against Paul. And that's the background to the question that we have here from Festus when he said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to be tried before me there on these charges?" Now, here's Paul's appeal. In Acts 25, verse 10 and 11, Paul replied, "I am standing at Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried." And with that statement, he was saying, I'm a Roman citizen. And that was a very significant thing because any Roman citizen had to be handled with caution in terms of any charges against them because they had a favored position and Paul was a Roman citizen. And he used that actually as a way to gain an opportunity to speak, but also an opportunity to protect himself. And we see that here. He said, continuing, "I have done no wrong to the Jews, as even you yourself know very well." Now he's talking straight to this governor, Festus. You know I haven't done anything wrong. If then I did anything wrong and am deserving of death, I am not trying to escape death, but if there is nothing to what these men accuse me of, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus consulted with his counselors, and he came back and said, "You've appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go." So here we have Paul going to a higher authority, even within the Roman Empire, for his protection. Now, you see, from a human point of view, Paul had really no recourse. He was falsely accused by the Jews. He was not having a fair trial, or he would not have had a fair trial, and he didn't have a fair trial before the Sanhedrin, before he was taken to Caesarea. He was not experiencing a fair trial there in Caesarea with the Roman government. And so he used his right to actually appeal to Caesar as a Roman citizen. Now, in this case, I believe that Paul was practicing a very important biblical principle, and here it is. I've already shared it with you, but let me review it. Since God has established government authorities to be his servants in administering justice, there may be times as believers when we should appeal to a court of law. And basically, this is one of those times. I believe that is very legitimate, and Paul used that freedom, that biblical freedom. But it's interesting that before Paul was ever taken to Rome, he had addressed this issue earlier in his letter to the church in Rome. And we read that in Romans 13:4. Probably he was in Corinth on the second missionary journey when he wrote the letter to the Romans. So this is a long time before he was taken into custody. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason, for it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. See, this was a statement that Paul actually had made in relationship to Christians who lived under Roman authority, saying that God has established authorities. Now, here he uses the word servant, not in the way we use the word servant, of being a servant of Jesus Christ. They were servants of the culture, servants of the society, because without rule of law, there's chaos and destruction. So Paul had appealed to that in his letter. He had taught that, and now he's practicing his freedom to appeal to a higher authority, which was Roman law. But there's another perspective that we have to factor in here, and that is when he wrote to the Corinthians, he talked about not going before judges or pagan authorities. He said this to the Corinthians: if any of you has a dispute against another, how dare you take it to court before the unrighteous, and not before the saints or before believers? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is not one wise person among you who is able to arbitrate between fellow believers? And basically what he is simply saying there is, as believers, we ought to be able to resolve the problems among brothers and sisters in Christ without going to a pagan court. But the fact of the matter is that there are some situations where we can't resolve those problems, and we have to go to the law that God has actually affirmed and which Paul had written about in terms of government. And for Paul, it was a last resort. At least he felt that, and he made that decision. And he, by the way, was not being challenged by fellow believers. He was being challenged and threatened by evil people who wanted to take his life, both within the Roman government as well as within the Jewish community. So here's a reflection and response question. Though lawsuits by Christians against Christians should be a last resort, what are some situations that justify going to a court of law? Well, one is unbelievers who will not seek spiritual counsel. What choice do we have? Well, God has given us a choice, particularly within our own government system. We may have no choice if we cannot resolve the problem with an unbeliever. And chances are we may not be able to do that. There are other situations as believers. We need a higher court, criminal activity. As a pastor, if I know about criminal activity, what does the law say? It's my responsibility. What about child sexual abuse? The law says if I don't report that when I know about it, I'm violating the law. And you know there's a large religious body that ignored that principle for a long, long time. And look what happened in terms of the clergy and sexual abuse within that large community that claims to be Christian. A violation of law and not resolving the problem even within the religious community. Unethical behavior beyond the ability of the church to resolve. Now, eventually, and sadly, the whole Roman system broke down eventually for Paul. And you see, because God has established government authority, doesn't mean that government authority cannot go towards evil. We have illustrations of that in Nazi Germany, for example. And we have an illustration of the Roman Empire, because the very thing that Paul appealed to, though it helped him initially, it helped him to get out of prison. He was there for 2 years in Rome in his own hired house, and then he was released. But when Nero found out about it, he took him back into custody. This time he went into a prison, an inner prison, in shackles, a dungeon. And when Paul wrote 2 Timothy, he knew that he was going to die. Even the Roman government would not protect him. And so, even though God has established governments, it doesn't mean that governments will not go evil, and that as believers we may face the consequences of that, because we have no one to appeal to who will help us and take our side. And that's exactly what Paul faced. And he wrote to Timothy and said, I finished the course. I've kept the faith. And henceforth, I'm going home. But we still have a principle to live by that grows out of this story. Government authority. Since God has established government authorities to be his servants in administering justice, there may be times as believers when we should appeal to a court of law.